Metal cold casting process. In this video, I'm going to be covering the process of doing a cold cast with metal powder and resin using what is called the dusting method. In this method, I dust the inside of a mold, in this case a soft 5110F platinum silicone matrix mold. I dust the inside of the mold with metal powder and then follow that up with a resin pour. In this case, I'll be pouring in TC802 polyurethane casting resin. This process is popular for figurines and statues that may not be practical for actual metal casting, and this process can be done with a variety of actual metal powders. Now to begin, we'll be doing this with tin powder. This is actual tin metal powder. This is some that I purchased from Sculpt Nouveau, and this is a very fine metal powder. So always a good idea to work in a well-ventilated area and make sure you're wearing a dust mask when you're handling powdered materials like this. Now, once I poured that into the mold, and I just poured a little bit into the top of the mold, and you see how fine it is there, and that soft silicone really grabs that metal powder and holds a thin veneer of that on the surface of the mold. And then I'm dumping out the excess. So I only dumped in just maybe a couple of ounces of metal powder into the mold, and then just dump that back out into the container. And what's left is that very thin film of metal powder that's held in place by that soft silicone. And this is why I mentioned earlier in that matrix video the importance of using a soft silicone for this process. Now I'll be pouring this up in TC802. This is a hard, fast-setting casting resin, and because it normally cures white, I'll be adding some 6903 ultra black pigment. And what this does, that combined with the natural white color of the polyurethane resin, gives us a dark gray, which works perfectly as a background color to the tin metal powder. And typically when I'm doing metallic effects like this, be it cold cast copper or bronze, I use either black when I'm doing the tin or aluminum powder, and then I use brown pigment anytime I'm doing copper, bronze, or brass. Now what I'm doing here is I'm filling the mold about a third of the way up, because the little Venus statue that I'm casting, her nose has a tendency to trap little pinhole air bubbles. So what I'm doing there is tilting it at a slight angle and then vibrating it to jostle those little air bubbles out of the face area. And once I've done that, then I'm going to fill up the rest of the mold. It's real important to understand the orientation of your part inside the mold so you can do things like that without worrying about creating other problems by moving the mold the wrong way. But just tilting the mold slightly and jostling it is usually enough to get those air bubbles out of the face. Now again, TC802 normally cures bright white, but by adding that ultimate black pigment, we can get a gray, kind of a charcoal gray color. And typically this cures in about 10 to 15 minutes at room temperature. And remember that polyurethane resin systems like this cure the inverse of an air drying material. They will cure in the thickest section first and radiate out from that. So the thickest area will cure first, the thinnest area will cure last. So typically I use whatever's left over in my mixing cup as a gauge for what's happening in the thinnest section of the mold. So there you see some of those little thin puddles around the base. That's a good way to check and make sure you're ready to demold your part. Now this is a soft, stretchy, seamless silicone mold, and I usually have an extra set of hands. Here I have my middle daughter here helping me demold this part. And now we're ready to polish our little sculpture. Now, depending on the resin you're using, sometimes it's a good idea to let it set and cure for a few more hours before you start polishing, but TC802 does cure up to a 73 Shore D fairly quickly, so we can start polishing. I typically do this about maybe an hour or two after I pulled my cast from the mold, and you see it shines up really easily. Now, real important detail, I'm using 4/0 steel wool for this process. 4/0 steel wool is considered ultra fine steel wool. If you use the coarser steel wool like 00, sometimes you can wind up just polishing right through that little veneer of tin or whatever kind of metal powder you have on the surface. So you want to be really careful that your part has completely cured so it's not too soft. And also very important to make sure that you don't use coarse steel wool like 00 or 000, because if you do, you will sand right through that to the just plain gray resin underneath. So real important, make sure you're using the ultra fine 4/0 steel wool. Now, one thing that can happen every now and then when you're doing cold cast metal parts like this is getting little air bubbles. This piece had a few little air bubbles on it, so I thought this would be a good video to explain the air bubble patching process. So typically the way it works is when you get a little air bubble like this, let's say it's in the chin of our little Venus figure. What we need to do first is fill that up carefully using a steel tool or eyedropper or anything else we can to fill that up with some of that raw metal powder. And once we've filled that up with the metal powder, what we're going to do is add to that some super glue. And what happens is the super glue will absorb into the metal powder, gluing everything into place. Now you can also prep the surface of your statue by a light spray of the super glue accelerator before you put your metal powder in, and you'll see me do that here in just a minute, and that will also speed things along. Now, once your super glue and metal powder have cured, you're ready to polish that area. And once you polish that, if done correctly, you can achieve the look of the surrounding piece and easily fill in those little air bubbles or other imperfections. Now, this is one of those processes that's much easier to do than it is to film yourself doing, so bear with me. So the first step here, I'm going to just wet that area with some of that super glue accelerator. That's the Instaset. You can pick this up at most hobby stores and just spray that into that little air bubble area. And then I'm going to use a steel dental tool just to scoop up a little bit of metal powder and push that into that hole. And it's okay if it gets outside that area. We can easily just brush off the extra metal powder. Now, metal powder is like gold these days, but it doesn't take much to do this process. And once we get that sculpted or filled in the way we need it to be, and again, it's very easy at this point to brush off any excess with your fingertip or a small paintbrush. And then we just take a drop of super glue and put that right on that air bubble. Now, on this particular one, once I added that to it, it soaked up some of that metal powder and caved in just a little bit, so that's okay. We just do it again. And you can do this back and forth until you fill up whatever size void that you're working with. Now, in addition to prepping the surface with some of that super glue Instaset, I can also use that over the top to instantly set that super glue that I've put that metal powder into. And that really speeds things along. And then you'll find that you're able to almost immediately polish that area. And this is why it's a good idea to keep your bad resin casts around for practicing these kinds of techniques, because this is one of those things that the more of it you do, the more comfortable you get with the process. And it's always best to experiment with this method on non-critical pieces. But overall, pretty straightforward, simple process. You just basically need some super glue, some of that Instaset, and of course more of the metal powder that you used for the original cast. Now you could either present your finished sculpture like this, or we could do some additional finishing work. And that's what we're going to do here is once we've got our little Venus lady polished, we're going to do a little bit of an antiquing effect using some Sculpt Nouveau brown wax. And to get a nice finish takes a very small amount of wax. In fact, this little 2-ounce jar of paste wax, I've been working out of this for probably over a year. So more than enough to last most of us mortals for a while. And what I'm doing here is just brushing this into the detail. And this particular wax, this dries and cures to a very hard wax finish. So real important, what we're doing here is to get that kind of antiquing effect. We're going to brush that all over our part and then take some clean paper towels and pull back that excess to get an antique silver finish. Now, as usual, I'll link all of the materials I used in the video description, so be sure to check those out. And of course, check the end screen for additional resources on polyurethane resin casting. Now, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. And of course, thanks for watching, and also thanks for supporting the channel.